Good evening, everyone. My name is Tara Pavlamenum. I'm from the University of Nebraska Public Policy Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the title of this forum is, Should the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy be maintained or lifted? And it is part of the Public Policy Center's annual Thomas C. Sorensen Public Policy Seminar Series. Co-sponsors of this forum include the American Democracy Project at UNK, the Lock and Key Society, a nonpartisan student organization for UNK students with interests in politics and policy, and the UNL College of Arts and Sciences through its Thomas C. Sorensen Endowment. On behalf of all of these organizations, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending the forum tonight. Let me also just briefly take this opportunity to thank Professor John Anderson, who I partnered with to convene this forum. He's shown a lot of interest in helping this, so thank you, John. I've worked with you for many years, and you really do excellent work here, so we look forward to continued work in the future. The United States military has historically prohibited gays from openly serving in the armed forces. President Clinton promised to end the ban on gays in military service, but he did not foresee strong opposition from both Congress and the military. After a series of hearings, in 1993, Congress passed into law what was an effective ban on openly gay service members by giving the military the authority to remove openly gay individuals. The stated purpose of the law was to prohibit homosexual behavior in the military because it was deemed potentially harmful to unit cohesion and morale, and not congruent with the military lifestyle. However, an executive order issued by President Clinton's Secretary of Defense prohibited the military from asking a service member what is his or her sexual orientation. Taken together, the law and the executive order amount to what we now call the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, in which gay individuals can serve in the military but cannot disclose their orientation or be asked what their orientation is. As most of you know, since 1993, this controversy has continued to grow. The debate has become increasingly strident, particularly because military has become more active overseas in recent years. Many servicemen and women have been discharged from the military because of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Most recently, President Obama has promised to end the policy, but is likely to seek repeal through an act of Congress rather than through an executive order. I should briefly mention that we contacted all 5 members of the state's congressional delegation. We asked them what their particular stance was on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We had one individual respond to us. That was from Senator Ben Nelson's office, and they did not commit to a particular stance on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It is now my pleasure to introduce our 2 very prominent speakers seated in the first row, and they'll both be coming up here shortly, who will be offering their perspectives on the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy and why it should or should not be repealed. James Bowman is a prolific writer and thinker on the national and international level, with a very long list of publications on a wide array of topics. He has served as American editor of the Times Literary Supplement of London, is a film critic for the American Spectator, and a media critic for the New Criterion. Among other well-known publications he has contributed to include Harper's, The Washington Post, The Washington Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Weekly Standard, and The National Review. And trust me, there are many, many others as well on that list. James has written and spoken extensively on the topic of honor, delivered one of the prestigious Bradley Lectures at the American Enterprise Institute entitled Whatever Happened to Honor, and in 2006 published a book by Encounter Books entitled Honor, A History, and I understand most recently published a new book entitled Media Madness, The Corruption of Our Political Culture, also by Encounter Books. James is currently a resident scholar at the well-known Washington-based think tank, the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He is a graduate of Lebanon Valley College and the University of Cambridge. If you're interested in learning more about James and his work, I would encourage you to visit the website for the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is www.eppc.org, or his own website, which is www.jamesbowman.net. Please give a hand for James Bowman. Now, we had a last-minute substitution, which occurred about a week or so ago. We had originally planned to have a gentleman named Alex Nicholson attend the event. Alex is the co-founder and executive director of Service Members United, an advocacy group that works on behalf of gay and lesbian troops and veterans. Unfortunately, Alex couldn't join us today because he had an appointment at Congress. Instead, we have the other co-founder of Service Members United joining us tonight, Jared Klopowski. I think I got that right. Jared Klopowski enlisted in the U.S. Army in 2000 and trained as a Korean linguist and cryptologic voice interceptor at the Defense Language Institute and Goodfellow Air Force Base, finishing second in his class. He worked as an interpreter and translator in Korea, supporting the 3rd Military Intelligence Battalion on more than 300 sensitive reconnaissance operations. Jared has been awarded both the Army Achievement Medal and the Army Commendation Medal during his time in service. However, he chose not to re-enlist because of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. In recent years, Jared has played a national role in developing public education campaigns aimed at ending the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, has been immersed in advocacy and policy work aimed at repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell as a member of the Washington, D.C.-based Human Rights Campaign. He's appeared on 60 Minutes, CNN, and in the Advocate magazine, among many others. He's a graduate of North Georgia Military College and the University of South Carolina, pursuing graduate work in international affairs. If you'd like to learn more about Jared and his work with Service Members United, I would encourage you to visit their website, www.servicemembersunited.org, all one word. Please welcome Jared Klopowski. And finally, let me introduce tonight's moderator, Professor John Anderson with Political Science. I've known John for many years. I've still never quite figured out what his political beliefs are, but I do know that he'll be asking some challenging questions of both our speakers. So again, thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to John Anderson.
Well, let me kind of give you the format of what we're going to do tonight, and what we hope is the structure of it. We think that this is a chance for us to have a civil discourse over a very important policy matter in the United States. And so this should be an opportunity for you to hear people present different sides of the issue and learn more about it. So it should be primarily informative. The way we're going to do that is we're going to allow both to have 10, 15 minutes to make a statement, tell you what they think and why. And then we'll give them a chance to ask each other a few questions. And then we're going to ask to get questions from you. But so that we can be sure they're questions and not statements, and also to make sure that we get some thoughtful kinds of questions. The way we're going to do that is we're going to have note cards that students from Lock and Key will hand out to you. You don't need to take one, but if you think you'd like to ask a question, pick those up, and we'll collect those at the time that we move to the Q&A for the audience. That way, we think it'll make you think more about the question you want to ask. But also, we'll use that to balance it, so we'll kind of ask questions on both sides and go back and forth. And that's what we're going to try to do tonight in order to give you a sample of civil discourse. So without further ado, let's start with James Bowman. We decided to have him speak first because he's going to defend the policy, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Abdul-Monem, for that very kind introduction, and Professor Anderson. Thank you for inviting me here to Kearney for the thankless task of defending a policy that left and right are united in regarding as at best misbegotten and at worst immoral. Of course, left and right have very different reasons for thinking so, but I think their common hatred of don't ask, don't tell and its more general unpopularity with those outside the armed forces anyway, is owing to the fact that it is, frankly, hypocritical, if that's not a contradiction in terms, frankly. It tells gay people who want to serve their country that a precondition of their doing so is that they must hide what Mr. Nathaniel Frank, one of the most prominent national spokesmen for the repeal of the law, calls who they are. If the right to be who you are is not written into the Constitution, We nowadays tend to think it can only be because it was so obvious a human right that the founders could never have imagined it would ever have to be guaranteed by law. The European Court of Human Rights found it so anyway, which is why the armed forces of Europe have had to admit the openly gay. But I'm afraid that being who you are is not a military concept. There are all kinds of ways in which military discipline requires that people suppress that emotional inner self that's presumed by so many to be the true self. Most obviously in the case of courage under fire. If it happens to be who you are to run away from the enemy, then it's time to be somebody else. Indeed, the whole point of military training is to take away one's precious individuality and replace it with a sense of group loyalty, which can no more be loyalty to the gay community than it can be to any other group outside the military unit itself. The fact that Mr. Frank and others of his persuasion regard being who they are as a good reason for integrating openly gay soldiers into the military is itself a good reason why they shouldn't be integrated, and an illustration of the detrimental effects such integration would have on the good order and discipline that the law speaks of. There are all kinds of things to which we have rights under the Constitution, including freedom of speech and assembly, which have to be suspended for those in the armed forces because of the unique demands of military service. Yet the advocates of repealing "Don't ask, don't tell" see the whole question as being one of civil rights, and they routinely draw a comparison between today's policy and the segregation by race that was commonplace in the military until Harry Truman ended that policy over the objections of many, it has to be said, of his military advisors in 1948. The assumption behind this analogy is that sexual behavior is as irrelevant to military discipline as skin color, an assumption which a moment's thought will persuade us is not the case. There are lots of ways in which behavior, including sexual behavior, is vitally and critically relevant to a soldier's or sailor's or marine's or airman's ability to do his job. And it would be irresponsible of both the civil and military leaders not to take the fact into consideration in judging who is and is not fit for military service. There are lots of ways, too, in which civil society should provide protection for gay rights. But this is not one of them. Civil has always been regarded as the opposite of military, and that's why in wartime ordinary civil liberties have at times to be suspended, even for non-military men and women, for the sake of national security. In the same way, those who are tasked with the defense of the nation have always been regarded as necessarily bound by different rules from those that bind the civilian population. They have their own restrictions on free speech, freedom of assembly, and so forth that could not be tolerated in civil society, and their own military courts to enforce these special forms of discipline under which they have to operate, if they are to operate at all. There are also certain physical requirements for the job they do, and no one would suppose, I trust, that blind, deaf, lame, or otherwise disabled people, or those over a certain age, though they are in every other way the equals of their fellow citizens, could be said to have been deprived of their civil rights merely on account of their being excluded from military service. Those under military discipline are further enjoined from certain kinds of sexual conduct known as fraternization when it is heterosexual, that would be perfectly okay if it took place outside a military context. Any sexualization, gay or straight, of the professional military environment is considered sexual harassment and is strictly forbidden. The problem of such sexual harassment remains a serious one for today's armed forces, and preventing or punishing it in order to allow women to serve alongside men takes up a substantial amount of time and energy, both administratively and on the part of ordinary soldiers who are required to undergo sensitivity training in time that would otherwise be spent training to do their jobs. Can our national security afford to create as a further burden on the time, attention, and morale of our fighting men and women, and the possibility of a whole new class of sexual harassment, and all the administrative apparatus required to deal with it, not to mention with the potentially violent backlash against such harassment when it happens in a homosexual context? I'm often accused when I say things like this of believing that all homosexuals are predatory, likely to hit on their comrades at the slightest opportunity. I believe no such thing. The point isn't what all homosexuals might or might not do, if there is anything that falls into that stereotypical category. The point is that Don't Ask, Don't Tell provides a simple and effective way of preventing certain kinds of predatory behavior that would otherwise be bound to happen from time to time, just as heterosexual rape and sexual assault do, without the disruptions to morale and discipline or the administrative burden of dealing with them that such behavior would similarly be bound to cause. Moreover, the bonds of trust and affection between men in combat, known as unit cohesion, referred to in the law, does depend to a considerable extent on an unstated confidence in the absence of any ulterior, that is, sexual motive on the part of one's comrades. Even if no one ever hit on anyone, that trust and affection would be compromised by the knowledge that such powerful feelings might be partially motivated by sexual desire. Another point that is often raised by the advocates of repeal is that there is no evidence that the presence of openly gay officers and men would be detrimental to good order and discipline, as if there were no evidential value in centuries' worth of tradition, as if it were possible to do a controlled experiment to measure the combat effectiveness of mixed gay-straight units against all straight ones. Having grown up in the 1960s, I can remember the easy ridicule with which so many in my generation treated traditional ideas about marriage and families. Our elders told us that we did things in the way people did them because they had always done them that way, and we thought this a pathetic sort of rationale. We said, as Mr. Frank and those of his persuasion now say, where is the evidence? Why can't we do things in a different way? Why can't we be free, in particular, to express our sexuality in any way we please without reference to outmoded social norms? But as many people now have been brought to recognize, there was a reason why people had always done things the way they had. Traditional notions of marriage and the family represented the wisdom of generations, though we could only find this out once we had broken up those traditional notions and dumped them in the trash can of history. Only then could there be really evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming, that the effects of marital breakups and sexual liberation for heterosexuals were disastrous for children and the society at large. We couldn't do a controlled experiment any more than we can now with the admission of open gays into the military, so we gave the benefit of the doubt to liberalism and change, which is what Mr. Schapowski and others of that persuasion want us to do again. That's fine if you're prepared to take the same risks with national security that society took with family formation and social cohesion in the 1970s. If you like the results of that, perhaps you'll also like the results of giving priority to gays' freedom to be who they are over those outmoded ideas about subordinating individuality to group identity. But at least you ought to know what you're putting at risk by making a prudential decision that, contrary to what you will be told by the other side, has nothing to do with individual rights. The other thing to be said about evidence is that, as we have now learned from the climate change emails, no science is as unbiased and impartial about its conclusion in practice as it is supposed to be in theory, and that goes double or triple for social science. You only have to read Stephanie Gutman's excellent book, The Kinder, Gentler Military, to see how the adverse consequences of having women serving on equal terms with men have been hushed up and made to seem invisible by officialdom. There are lots of studies, lots of evidence that there are no such adverse consequences, but political correctness in the military, as elsewhere in the government, has set those studies up so as to be blind to those consequences. Anyone who doubts this should speak to ordinary servicemen, or, as Ms. Gutman's found, even women, about the disparity between the politically correct policies under which they are forced to operate and the more troubling realities of the services. But the civilian leadership is, and has been for a long time, heavily invested in the pretense that the force's fighting effectiveness has remained unimpaired by gender norming and inappropriate sexual conduct, and any officer who values his prospects for promotion is not going to do anything to expose that pretense. The same will be true of that other priority of the civilian leadership today, the admission of open homosexuals to the military. The whole debate about don't ask, don't tell is based on the assumption that being gay is not just something you are, but also something you choose. That is, people's desires may be inborn, but the identification of oneself, who you are, in Nathaniel Frank's terms, with those desires and the culture that has grown up around them in the liberal societies of the West, is a choice. I have not heard even the most passionate advocate of repealing don't ask, don't tell argue that one's desires leave one powerless to choose any other identity over that which we associate with open gayness in this country. The closet is regarded as a legitimate choice by a great many gay people, even when they might come out of it without fear, and all but the most militant and most politicized of their out fellow homosexuals regard this as a choice to be respected. The military, therefore, simply asks of homosexuals what it asks of goths or punks or bikers or any of the other myriad of identities on offer in the great American cultural smorgasbord, that these rival identities should be subordinated to one's self-identification as an American service member for the duration of their service. It seems to me not too much to ask of those who claim to be prepared to make a much greater sacrifice for their country. Thank you.
So I have no sense of voice modulation, so let me know if I'm not loud enough. Thanks. Okay, so Monday, November 30th, 16 years ago, Bill Clinton signed into law 10 U.S.C. 654. I'm not going to read the whole law for you, but what it mostly did is it first recommended commanders to cease asking recruits if they're gay. Right? We know this is don't ask. It also stated that the armed forces must maintain personnel policies that exclude persons whose presence in the armed forces would create an unacceptable risk to the armed forces' high standards of morale, good order, and discipline, and unit cohesion that are the essence of military capability. And then it further went on to define or to state that the presence in the armed forces of people who demonstrate the propensity to engage in homosexual acts to be detrimental to those particular military attributes. We know this is don't ask, don't tell. What I'd like to do is first look at the law, don't ask, don't tell. Then I'd like to look at the justification for it. Look at the unit cohesion and kind of examine it. Like, what is unit cohesion? Why is this so important to the military? I'd also like to take a second to provide my own personal perspective because I do think it's important. And after that, kind of go into the implementation of don't ask, don't tell. Was it implemented as it was intended? And then the difficulties that we have right now in achieving the necessary consensus to get rid of it, because this is very different than when we integrated African Americans and females into the military. Now let's look at the law. Which military is don't ask, don't tell really examining? I mean, it describes, being openly gay, being an open lesbian is detrimental to the military, but this is the military of 16 years ago. This is an entire generation ago. This is a military that did not grow up with Will and Grace, did not grow up with the real world. And they viewed the military as much, or viewed gays and lesbians as much more exotic as they do today. Is this a really good gauge? Is this a really good, or an appropriate law, appropriate to this generation? How will these service members react? We know that polls today indicate that roughly the same amount of people that were opposed to open service back in 1993 now are approve of open service and have no problems with gays and lesbians. About 70%. And are the perspectives of the service members equivalent today to the generation ago? I would say not. Now, this idea of unit cohesion, right? I think what a lot of people who are opposed to don't ask, don't tell think of unit cohesion as the idea that in that initial bonding experience, you create this sort of bond that you cannot overcome with someone who's different than you, like someone who has similar experiences, someone who might come from Nebraska, who might be of the same gender, might be of the same ethnic background, would be much easier to bond with than someone who you have no idea who the other might come from, Minnesota, who really doesn't share any of your background. And in 1993, the Rand Corporation went into different military units, investigated what the true nature of unicohesion was. And what they found is that it wasn't that initial bonding experience, the similarities, that encouraged people to cohese. It was repeated exercises together, it was shared experiences. The idea that people who don't bond immediately can never bond in the future, they found was wrong. They didn't go into it specifically to look into whether or not gays and lesbians should openly serve. They looked at it as more as the idea of whether or not open sexuality would be detrimental to cohesion. They found that that was not the case. For whatever reason, this study was not taken into consideration when Don'tAskDon'tTell was put into place, and we still use that unicohesion argument. Now, as far as my own personal experience, I was openly gay the entire time I served. I served 5 years in the U.S. Army as a Korean linguist. When I joined, I did not know that I was gay. I had not come to terms with being gay. For that reason, there's a lot of people who are about my age who join the military, 18 or 19. They really aren't at a point where they're mature enough, a lot of them, to accept being gay. And so you have a situation where you have people joining the military 3 years later after joining, come to terms with being gay. You can't create any sort of policy that can keep gay people out of the military. Don't Ask, Don't Tell does not keep gays out. And then you have situations like mine where we choose to be open because of the arbitrary nature of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The wording is very vague. You have situations where, in my case, where the commanders chose not to use my evidence of me being openly gay to discharge me. But you have other situations where third-party evidence could be used to discharge someone. I had a friend whose mom went on post. She was afraid that he was going to get kicked out of the military, so she went and helped him out and told the command that he was gay, and they discharged him. He didn't ask. The command didn't ask. This person didn't tell, and yet they were still discharged. You have situations where provided patient confidentiality is not protected. It's someone who talks to the chaplain, who talks to their psychologist, and admits to being gay. That evidence can be used to discharge them without any consequence to the healthcare provider. This is a severe consequence to people who suffer from PTSD because talking about your relationships is essential to recovery. During the Iraq and Afghanistan war, people who are suffering from PTSD and who are gay cannot achieve full recovery. Also, and we know that there's a higher incidence of people who do serve overseas who are gay and lesbian because we see a decrease in discharges at times of war, which kind of goes against the idea that it would be detrimental to cohesion. We send people overseas, we send them to Iraq and Afghanistan, let them serve, and then we discharge them when they come back. Which again highlights the hypocrisy of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The problem right now with repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell is that we're in a situation where Don't Ask, Don't Tell is a law. We have, for that reason, have to achieve a much higher consensus. Whenever we integrated African Americans into the military, when we integrated females into the military, it was done via executive order. And for that reason, like the president would go in and let his generals know, say, I'm going to do this, you must listen to me, and they'd have to go along with it. They can't do that with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And another situation with integrating African Americans in the military, we did see a number of generals threaten to resign, threaten to go out of the military. You saw a number of troops threaten to leave the military, advocate, and none of this happened. These are threats. Threats do not reflect actual behavior. We also know that in different countries, such as the UK, such as Israel, when they did choose to lift their ban, we did not see any sort of mass exodus. We did not see any sort of increase of harassment of troops, and it was okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and end with a few numbers on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, just so we can kind of look at the full cost of this, because this isn't existing in a vacuum. It's Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Some may perceive to have benefits, but a lot of the damage of Don't Ask, Don't Tell is often not investigated, like the true damage. One number that you hear often is the 13,000 that are discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell since implementation in 1993. One number that you don't hear often is the amount that choose not to re-enlist because of the policy. Like myself, it's 4 times the amount. Another number that you see a lot is the $363 million. That is the fiscal cost of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That was estimated. It came out in 2006, I believe. And it was an update from a previous estimate of about 186 million, I want to say. But the way that number came about, that it was determined that it cost about $20,000 to train one service member, and a number of other training costs were not taken into consideration. When the reality is, like when the cost of training one linguist is about $500,000. And so the true number, when you look at that number and you take the true training costs, then you also multiply by 4 for the people who choose not to re-enlist, is probably closer to about $10 billion. These are costs that not only are true fiscal waste, they affect national security because this money can be used for better means. And the cost, going in the national security perspective, one linguist being discharged is more than just that person's life that's affected. It's more than just his personal life that has changed. That service member is also essential to upper echelon units. I knew a couple of linguists, Arabic linguists, who entire brigades depended on. Losing that one linguist would be detrimental. We cannot do the mission that we need to do unless we have those linguists. This policy is outdated, it's damaging, and for that reason, it's unnecessary from a generational perspective. And so with that cost-benefit analysis, a number of us propose that Don't Ask, Don't Tell should be repealed. Thank you.
For the purposes of the next phase, you might find it comfortable to come up here so you can see each other. But I want to give you each an opportunity to ask questions of each other. James, do you have a question for Jared? A comment?
Yes, I'd like to hear if you say that the policy is outdated and damaging, and that may be so. Do you recognize, however, any damage that might come from repeal?
Well, I know you did mention possible increases in incidences of harassment as a possible consequence. But what I would offer is that, Don't Ask, Don't Tell really doesn't protect from that. Like creating any sort of proverbial code of silence really doesn't detract from any of the abuse of these particular conditions that we're considering. I know what is often brought up are foxholes, showers, and submarines, like these close quarters where these people are serving close next to each other, where incidents of harassment may or may not be more likely. But the type of individual that would be prone to harassment isn't going to be deterred by any sort of policy that tells them to be quiet. I mean, it's a certain type of character that does that really isn't going to adhere to that. So I don't think Don't Ask, Don't Tell provides that kind of protection. I really can't think of a law that would, gay or straight.
You want him to ask, or do you want?
Either way.
I can.
You have a follow-up? Go ahead.
Well, it does. It doesn't. That's true. I mean, if harassment is going to take place, it's going to take place, and the law will not prevent it from taking place. But what Don't Ask, Don't Tell does make possible is a swift resolution of the problem, because the harasser is simply dismissed. You don't have to go through these processes of hearings and so on, and sensitivity training and all the rest of it that goes with the heterosexual examples of sexual harassment.
I would argue you also have situations where the person who's harassed might be afraid to report the incident because they might be afraid to be called gay and discharged from Don't Ask, Don't Tell as well. I have heard situations of that happening. I've had troops come up to me and repeated that kind of situation. I mean, when you have that fear of being associated with anything that is gay or lesbian, it kind of prevents reporting those types of incidences.
Okay, that sort of supposes that it is a fear. This is part of the assumption of the of the gay lobby, I think, is that the word homophobia, for instance, is the assumption that those who are in favor of Don't Ask, Don't Tell are somehow afraid of gay people. I don't think that's the case. I don't see any evidence of that.
Well, that's not the, I'm sorry, I didn't offer, what I meant to say is that it's the fear of being discharged. I don't think it's the fear of like being associated with the word gay.
Oh, I thought that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
People were so afraid of being mocked that
Oh, no,
they wouldn't dare report.
Well, you know, I would like you to start thinking of questions you'd like to ask, but I have one that came to mind. I didn't hear anyone talk about rights, that this is a matter of a right of some sort.
I did in order to dismiss that
Right.
that contention, but that would have been another question of mine. Do you think it is a right to serve the military?
And Terry, what would you say?
I think if you're physically fit and capable of serving in the military, I think it's absolutely your right to enlist and become an officer, or become an enlisted personnel. I don't think being gay should prohibit from serving. So I do believe that gays and lesbians should be able to serve without any reservation. Currently, under policy to make up for the numbers that we don't have gays and lesbians serving, we're allowing convicted felons to join. Right? We're allowing people who've given terrorist threats. We've allowed rapists to join. We have numbers that prove this. It's called the Moral Waiver Program. And if those people can serve, if not to say that being gay is equivalent to any of those,
Is it their right as well?
is it their right? I would argue that we shouldn't allow them to serve. But those, I would say,
That's not their right.
I would say having a rapist join the military is much more detrimental to unit cohesion than being gay could ever be.
Quite possibly, yes. But it's
but
not
I
his
don't-
right. It's not why should it be the gay person's right, but not his right?
Because there's really nothing.
He's physically fit and able to do it.
Right, if the gay or lesbian can show that they can do the job and it's not detrimental to the unit for them serving, I don't see any reason for them not to join.
Well, that's sort of what we're talking about here.
Right.
I've suggested several reasons why they shouldn't join. What you bring up in respect to unit cohesion seems to me to be one of those dubious social science surveys that is designed precisely to ignore the thing that it's supposedly talking about. Unit cohesion is really, if anything ever is, it's an intangible. It's not something that you can measure. It's not something that you can do a study of and say, oh yes, being gay makes no difference to it. I think it is something. It's a form of love between men, and that love is predicated on the fact that it is a non-sexual love. It seems to me. What makes the two kinds of love up is a danger to the other kind, the non-sexual kind.
Right, so I've got some questions here from the audience. Hopefully I can get this right. The military was a jet setter when it came to allowing African Americans into the military. If they took a similar stance in this case, would it have a similar effect of increased support for the military? I would guess that would be increased support for the military. So to summarize the question, when African Americans were allowed in the service, I suppose that developed more African American support for the military. Would a similar kind of phenomena occur if we were more open about allowing gays and lesbians in?
It's hard for me to imagine how the military could be much more supportive than it is now. It's one of, not the most popular institution in American public life. It might go even higher. I don't know, but it's pretty high to start with.
Often when I'm working on this issue, I receive a wide variety of opinions from both sides of the issue that are against repeal. Some come from the gay rights lobby, who believe that, you know, if it's an institution that doesn't want them serving, then why should I support it? So from that particular community, I think there would be much larger support, and then from the progressive community in general. We see different colleges like Harvard, Yale, who have, have issues with their RTC programs, allowing them to stay in school because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So ROTC would be allowed back on those campuses, and you would see much more support from those college crowds.
Please, I don't see a lot of people writing questions, but we'd love to have a number from you, so work on them. Here's another one. I know many people have come home from the military in Iraq, both men and women. Many of my gay friends from the military said sex was forbidden on base, yet they sold condoms on base. My friends also said they had sex with straight, bi, gay partners more than twice a week. Obviously, preventive methods are failing. What other actions can the government take to help make so-called preventive methods work, I suppose? I guess it's a statement to say, look, this is already a mess.
It's always failed, hasn't it? I mean, there's always been gays in the military. There's always been sex in the military. You can try and pass laws against it or do other ways of other things to try and exclude it, but it's always going to be there, and it's a fact of life that you have to cope with in some ways. It seems to me, and that's precisely the virtue of Don't Ask or Tell. As intellectually unsatisfactory as it is, practically it seems to me to have that advantage, that its very hypocrisy is the thing that allows us to deal with these practical situations that don't respond to law and order and rules and regulations and all that sort of thing. The kind of behavior that's going to go on. In any case, there is something that has to be done about it, and Ask Don't Tell is one of the things that is done. So,
would you say that your position on this is that Don't Ask, Don't Tell is certainly imperfect, but it keeps a lid on matters?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I mean, I would disagree to a certain extent. I mean, it's, like you said, people are going to have sex regardless on post. You have a situation where they're much more quiet about it, they're much more sneaky about it, they might go off post to do it, if it happens. But I think that's also the presumption that, troops that are gay are necessarily going to find each other and necessarily going to have sex with each other. I don't think that's that prevalent where where Johnson totally provides any sort of advantage preventing it.
Here's another question. What are the respective public opinion polls in the general U.S. population and in the military on this topic? How has public opinion, the military's opinion, changed from 16 years ago? Which is something I think you referred to. I don't know if either of you really know those answers, but it would be nice to understand it.
One problem is it's very difficult to poll the military guys for security reasons, partly. You don't have any really good polling information taken from a military sample. The Military Times a year ago did a poll, a sort of mail-in poll, a voluntary poll that was anonymous. People were invited to say what their attitude was. These are serving soldiers, and found that 58% were against repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And of course, there's all kinds of problems with the sample. You don't know how reliable that sort of information is. But I think in those that I've talked to on the other side, on those that are in favor of repeal, don't deny that probably a majority of serving servicemen are against repeal.
You look at these polls, like the Military Times polls, military.com polls, and I think the DEOMI just did a poll on mine as well.
What is DEOMI?
The Defense Equal Opportunity, and the MI is military. I'm not sure what the I stands for. But anyways,
Department of Defense.
It's DoD, and they do these surveys online. They are very unscientific. They're promoted to particular audiences, and they're run by people who are looking for a particular answer. And these polls have also been easily exploited by other organizations to point them in the direction that they want. So those polls often don't produce the kind of any sort of tangible data that we can really use to gauge where people are on the issue. The Zogby Institute in 2006, though, did do a scientific poll of service members. I think it was about 500 odd service members in 2006. And they did find that the vast majority, or not the vast majority, but at least the majority of those who do serve were okay serving with people who were gay or lesbian.
Yeah.
The terminology they used was comfortable around, right? And what comfortable means is something that's often debated, but the fact is that you had these active duty service members who willingly submitted this information on a survey, who generally don't trust surveys anyways. And the majority of them still believe that Don't Still should be repealed. This is also...
No, not the Zogby poll. Even in the Zogby poll, there was a plurality against repeal. It was 38 to 27, or something like that.
No majority.
No majority, but it was something like 30, another 36 were neutral. But it was framed in such a way as to get, as you say, to get the answer that it wanted by saying, are you comfortable around gay people? Well, who's going to answer that? No, I'm not comfortable around gay people. It's a question that's designed to get a particular answer.
Well, that 28% is still not the majority of service members for this policy, which is what you presented earlier.
No, well, it's another one of those unreliable numbers. But even those numbers were 38 to 28, 27 or something like that against repeal.
Women and men are able to serve in the same unit. You talked about the sexual urge between gays and lesbians, but when women were allowed to join, how can you determine the differences?
I'm sorry, could you read that again?
Yeah, let's see. Since men and women are able to serve in the same unit, we know that you talked about sexual urge between gays and lesbians, but when women were allowed to join, how did that affect the same phenomenon? I guess that's what the question is about. It's a little hard.
I spoke about that.
Yeah.
I think it affected things very, very seriously. There is an awful lot of sexual harassment that goes on in the military because of that decision, because women serve alongside men. It's one of the consequences, and we've been willing as a society to pay the price in terms of time taken away from military training to do sensitivity training and all the rest of it, because we consider for social reasons it's very important for women to be treated equally with men, even in a military context. But there have been very serious consequences as a result of women being allowed to serve alongside men.
There have been incidences, but the fact is that females have been slowly integrated into the services, but they have not been allowed to serve particular jobs, which has slowly changed over the years. There is no real, not as strong incentive to be politically correct by increasing the amount of jobs women can serve in. They already are serving in the military. That's already been accomplished. Mavis, Secretary of the Navy Mavis, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mullen, and the Chief of Naval Operations, Ruffhead, have all come to the consensus that females should now be allowed to serve on submarines. If sexual harassment, if those issues were so prevalent as to be detrimental to the military, there should be no incentive for them to increase the amount of jobs for females to serve in, regardless of whatever sort of politically correct perspective they want to present. But yet they still are going forward with this particular improvement.
Oh, I think there's every incentive. The incentive is that the way you get to be promoted to those upper echelons is by going along with the politically correct view of these things. That's why they do this. The culture in which the military has to operate these days is not going to look favorably upon anyone who finds problems with women serving equally with men. It just isn't.
Is that a Pentagon culture, or is that broader culture?
It's very much a Pentagon culture, but it's obviously formed by the broader culture that comes from civilian control of the military. And it's interesting because, as you say, the president has the power to change policies in these areas, but it's not just the president, it's the president and Congress. It's the two elected branches that have these powers, and Congress has been very much pushed to one side in all this argument. Congress passed the law as it exists now, and what's being proposed very much by those in favor of repeal is that the president overrule that law, the law passed by Congress and signed by President Clinton. It's really, and it's one of many ways in which the congressional powers of oversight over the military are being, and have been for many years, pushed to one side, because it's almost entirely an executive branch operation, and that's one way in which this kind of political correctness gains its influence, because it's bureaucrats, it's not elected people.
This is a different angle for you. This question starts with the hypothetical. If there was a draft and a person was a homosexual and was drafted, would they have to serve? And I guess, you know, the ethical question, or maybe the legal question out of that, how could that be? How could you draft someone, require them to come in, and then let people who, because of their sexual preference, not serve, while others would have to serve?
You know, even Charlie Moscos, who's the architect of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, has stated that if we were to introduce a draft, then Don't Ask, Don't Tell would have to be repealed because for that particular consideration. If we're at the point where we need sort of strong numbers that the political capital will be sacrificed to reinstitute the draft, then there really is no reason to keep the policy in place to meet personnel needs. But as it stands, if a draft were reinstituted, then people who are gay or lesbian would not be part of the draft.
You know, it always used to be the case when we had the draft that there was this exclusion of homosexuals came in with psychiatry during World War II, with the growth and of influence of military psychiatry. They're the ones who invented the idea of homosexuality as not just as behavior, but as a whole personality type, which was unfit, supposedly, for military service. But always before that, and when we had a draft, there was no, there was such a thing as you know, moral turpitude or sexual perversion. But for that, you had to have proof of actual behavior. It wasn't a sort of personality type, which is what those army psychiatrists in World War II brought in. And that's just a reflection of the enculturation, I suppose, of the gay lifestyle.
This question is for Mr. Bowman. Do you think the possible fiscal cost of repealing the ban on gays from serving in the military would outweigh the fixed cost of another 13,000 or another year of the policy, where another possible 13,000 troops would be involuntarily discharged and over 50,000 troops would choose not to stay in?
Well, these numbers are also, I'm afraid to say, very unreliable. We don't know the figure of 13,000 has been mentioned. A much higher figure has been mentioned. Another recent study that I've read said that the number of people being discharged for that reason or leaving for that reason, which is where the higher number came from, is no higher than it's been. It's around 1% of those who leaves, supposedly. We could go into the numbers all night, but it seems to me that the costs you have to count on, and then there are costs both ways, it seems to me. You lose people either way. But the real costs that matter are the costs in terms of national security that come from taking attention away from fighting wars and putting it on to social experimentation.
This question's for you, Jared. For straight servicemen and women, what could you say to reassure them from having to worry about breaches of their privacy or having to worry about gays possibly focusing on them as potential sexual interests?
Well, I think it really comes down to conditions that already exist, right? Gays and lesbians are serving right now. Don't Ask, Don't Tell does not keep them from serving. So if there's any sort of, like I mentioned earlier, if there's any sort of predatory intent, Don't Ask, Don't Tell is not going to protect them. any sort of policy that supposedly keeps gays and lesbians from serving or deters them from serving is not going to keep gays and lesbians out, is not going to keep predatory characters out, whether or not it's gay, straight, or otherwise. So what I would say is that the situation is really not going to change. Your risk isn't going to change, and chances are, you know, these service members are just professionals you are, and they're not going to harass you. And being, like I think was mentioned earlier, you know, being gay or lesbian does not necessitate that you're a predator, but those predatory elements have nothing to do with being gay or lesbian either.
Jim, this one's for you. I'm going to change it a little bit. I think the major point of this is that when you spoke earlier, you talked about people who are closeted being very similar to people who have to hide their identity if they were a punk, a biker, etc. And maybe you'd like to, I guess the question would be, could you make that point again as a part of your argument? And you'll like this at the end. By the way, you are an excellent speaker.
Thank you. My point is that the gayness is, I'm sure, as gay people will tell you, is not a choice. It's something they're born with or born as. Insofar as it concerns their desires. But gayness is also a choice because it is also a cultural phenomenon. It is not just a certain form of sexual behavior. It's also a certain way of living in a certain community. And that depends, that's what depends on openness. In order to have that gay community, as we now have it, you have to have openness. And yet there are a substantial number of people who are gay, but who are not, who choose not to be part of that community. And as I said in my speech, most open gay people respect that choice. They think that it's okay for people to choose not to, gay people like themselves, not to be a part of, quote, the gay community. And it seems to me that that is not an unreasonable attitude to take for non-gay people as well when it comes to military service, because there are lots of other kind of communities that have to do with identifications with certain kinds of behaviors that have to be suppressed when people go into military service, and it seems to me that gayness ought to be one of those.
Would you like to respond?
Well, I think the key word here is choice. I mean, these people who choose to stay from the closet, really, I mean, they have that choice to do it because it's something that's allowed to them. You don't have that in the military right now under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They don't have the choice to go back in the closet. It's something that's forced on them. There's been studies associated with, you know, trying to put in place the Employee Non-Discrimination Act that have looked at situations where people are in a setting where it's okay for them to be gay, they're not going to be fired by company policy, but they still don't feel necessarily in a situation where it'd be okay, and they choose at that point to stay in the closet because they have the intellect to investigate their own situation and make that choice themselves. And I think it'd be very similar to Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Well, they choose to go into the military. You know, the choice is just one degree removed. In order to choose to go into the military, that's the choice. It entails certain other choices that it requires that people make, and it entails that among lots of people, not just gays.
I think that'd be an unnecessary burden, though, to ask someone to, you know, violate something that's so key to serving the military, the idea of integrity, in order to serve. And then you have this.
Is not the right way to go. Integrity is much different concept as far as I'm concerned. To advertise to the world what your sexual behavior is not a function of integrity. I mean, it seems to me there's all kinds of ways in which we may remain reticent about our private behavior without compromising our integrity.
I think that's a misunderstanding of what is meant when someone says open sexuality. Like they're going to go out and they're going to wave rainbow flags, or they're going to You know,
Well, what does it mean?
it means that they're going to have the option to not get fired if it happens to be found out. That's it. It means that
Well,
when
they've got that up
you're
here.
with these soldiers 24/7. You are serving with them 24/7. It's very unreasonable for your personal life never to come up. You talk to straight service members, they talk about their sexual escapades all the time to each other. They talk about their girlfriends, they talk about their wives, and it'd be unreasonable to tell them not to say, oh, that can't ever come up. You know, and so to have that kind of restriction on gays and lesbians, it's kind of unrealistic. And to say, well, that's their choice, it's not really their choice. It's an excessive burden, and we found it, and I think in today's military, from my own experiences, it's unnecessary.
Mr. Bowman, you discussed the importance of military regulating service members' behavior. This is kind of a follow-up on this. But the service members being discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell for talking to military chaplains, psychiatrists, etc., have not engaged in openly sexual behavior that is prohibited. So why is it reasonable for the military to discharge people on the basis of third-party reports?
I don't think it is reasonable. It seems to me no argument against Don't Ask, Don't Tell to say that Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been violated by these people because these people didn't ask and they didn't tell, and yet they were dismissed anyway through the violation of a confidential relationship of some kind. I think there's no excuse for that. But it's not an argument against Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
I think we've gone through quite a few questions here, and I'd like to respect the audience's need to go study or whatever it is they might have to do next. So I'm going to ask you to kind of boil down your argument and tell us really why it is that you have the position that you have as a way to conclude it. And if you'd like to stay and come up front and ask questions and have a little more informal conversation, I'd invite you to do that. James, you got to start, so let's let Jared have first shot at this one.
I think it really comes down to is two ideas, right? That this is detrimental to unit cohesion, and that there is a generational shift where this is unnecessary. Not just, yeah, it is detrimental to unit cohesion and national security. So when you have a law in place that is by nature a failed policy, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to have situations like third-party discharges or situations of providing patient confidentiality. And you have a generational shift where it's really not consequential to allow open service, then you have a policy that must at least be investigated, and I believe the conclusion will be that Don't Ask, Don't Tell should be repealed.
The question does come down, as the law puts it, to I think the question of unit cohesion, and it's that which we haven't really got to this evening. I think it's partly because it's so difficult to get at. It's such a, as I said earlier, an intangible, if ever there was one. But it seems to me that in the final analysis, the argument has to be that the military ought to get to decide who is and is not qualified to serve, not politicians, bureaucrats, or somebody else. We give this privilege to other professionals, to doctors, to lawyers, to even to plumbers and carpenters, to decide who is and is not qualified to join that fraternity, because it involves who can tell better than someone who's already doing the job, who knows what it takes to do it. And it seems to me that in the end, if the armed services are uncoerced and unpressured by political correctness, prepared to allow gays, then they ought to be allowed, and if they're not, they ought not to be. It's as simple as that. And what information we have now suggests that, in spite of the politically correct pressures on them, the military is opposed, and I think that should be respected.
Thank you very much. Thanks for